All right, welcome everybody. My name is Andrew Barry. I'm the CEO of Curious Lion. So we are a consulting and advisory firm that specializes in helping companies cultivate learning culture, which is going to be the topic of our conversation today. Before we get started on that, I just want to ask each of our guests to quickly introduce themselves.
Rebecca Scales, actually former learning architect at Expedia for technical training. I'm looking for my next gig, and super excited about talking specifically about like the learning culture around engineering, data science, and all of those technical areas. That's really been my focus for the last about 6.5 years of my career. So excited to talk a little bit more about that.
Hi, everybody. Todd Tauber. I lead corporate strategy at Degreed. Andrew invited me to be part of the panel because my team led a research project called How the Workforce Learns, which is essentially about the sort of workforce perspective on learning culture.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Buchanan. I lead learning and development for the field for Sam's Club. So I'm responsible for all the learning, development, and upskilling for our 100,000 frontline associates at our 600 clubs.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Phylicia Jones. I work for PagerDuty. I'm the Senior Director of People Development. And my team oversees the learning experiences from onboarding, learning, career development, performance management, you name it. We try to give people career-making moments at PagerDuty.
Thank you. So before we get started, I'd love to know, there's been a lot of sessions, I think, in this room about culture and workplace culture. Today we're going to be talking about learning culture. So I just wonder from a show of hands, who uses that term learning culture? Okay. Who thinks they fully understand exactly what it means? Okay. I think that's the interesting thing for us to explore today. So as an initial question, PJ, maybe we can start with you over at the end there. What does learning culture mean to you at PagerDuty?
Yeah, I mean, it's a loaded question, but I try not to even use the word learning culture. I think culture is a feeling. And there's a feeling that I want any Dutonian to walk into our learning experience, and there's a feeling that they get. And they know they've been to a kind of a learning experience that was been led by my team because there's some community agreements that every learner has decided to agree to build a space of learning. There's also this sense of we're going to drive alignment we're coming to spaces where we want to learn together. I see and I hear you and want to learn from each other. So it's not just the facilitator who's actually driving the learning, it's the peers who are learning from each other. So, and then it's also the idea of like driving accountability. That when you lead the learning experience, can you actually reach out, not to the facilitator, but to a peer you met, because you feel safe to actually ask them questions because there's a similar experience that you shared in that moment. So I try to think about, are those the behaviors and feelings that someone's walking away with? And if that's the case across multiple learners, then I know I've driven a learning culture. So I'm looking for those micro moments that we try to infuse in every minute of learning, and then are people coming back for more to get that sense of belonging in that space?
Jen, I think one of the interesting things I learned about Sam's Club is I think you used the words, you're closing down the classroom, right? And sort of and meeting people where they are. So how does learning culture fit into that context?
Yeah, so I think I would have given you like a different answer probably pre-COVID. I would have given you a very L&D answer that you would have eaten up. But look, during COVID, the clubs didn't close. Frontline associates came to work every day. And what we realized during that time, and what we should have been doing all along, is that associates should have the opportunity to grow, learn, and upskill simply by doing their job. They should be able to pursue those growth opportunities without having to leave the club. So the piece that you're talking about with the close down of the classrooms is as we started to make that transition, upstairs in Sam's Club, we have windowless training rooms, right, that have a traditional computer where associates would get their learning experiences. And so we were giving learning experiences and then expecting associates to apply that learning, let's say 30 days later, right? So it just didn't make sense. And we realized we needed to have associates be able to get the learning as a pull versus a push in the moment of the need. Well, what we needed to enable that was technology. So in our clubs, we are issuing handhelds to all associates. And issuing handhelds to all associates is one of the things that enabled us to close the training rooms, because we're able to push all of the experiences to associates on the floor. And we're on this journey of closing down the classrooms. We had closed down, I think it was 38 or 39 of them before I left to come here. And I mean, the thing that I would say is that we're not saying all learning comes through the handheld for the rest of your life. We're saying, hey, you know what? We're digital at core, but we'll be in person when it makes sense from a retention and effectiveness standpoint.
That's great. Todd, what would you like to add?
My definition of learning culture is pretty simple. It comes straight from the dictionary. When you look it up, it's something along the lines of shared attitudes, values, and behaviors within a group. Right? So you stick the word learning in front of that, and it's the attitudes, values, and behaviors that people share around learning at work. And it's really that simple. The hard part, I think, is describing and defining for a lot of people what that looks like. What are the attitudes, what are the values, what are the behaviors that we want in people, and then how. Right? That's where I think a lot of people struggle. Overcomplicate it by making it a bunch of things. But I think if you have this conversation and you talk to enough people, you find a lot of commonalities in the definitions. It's really more the, what exactly do you want, do you need in your organization? And the how part that is the interesting side for me.
Yeah, and I think we've already heard a couple of things. We'll tease out some more aspects and sort of key features of what makes a great learning culture. And I know your research that you've done will help with that. Rebecca?
Yeah, I think, kind of the traditional learning and development definition, possibly prior to COVID, was having a lot of learning opportunities available for people, right, and having them sign up. I think now, our perspectives, at least hopefully, should be changing, and that should be not only as like a central learning and development organization providing learning opportunities, but then providing opportunities for folks like our engineers and our data scientists to actually give back to their own community, right? So it's not just about them consuming information, but it's about them giving the information as well. When you have tech teams that are working in really like cutting edge technologies, they are learning things that have never been published before, right? So giving them an opportunity to create that content that may be really interesting. And by the way, it doesn't have to go into a learning management system. It can, go into GitHub repos where the developers are actually working. So it's like, to me, the culture is not just providing those learning opportunities, but giving them the opportunity to teach, because best learning really happens when you teach. And so that, to me, is that nice little cycle. I love it when a class closes in under 2 minutes, right? I love that kind of desire, but I also love it when people are clamoring to actually learn to teach as well. So I think it goes both ways.
And we'll come back to the instructor academies and stuff that you worked on there. I was on a panel this morning, and a good analogy for a lot of this is one of the panelists, who now is in the creator economy creating cohort-based courses, used to work at Oracle. They have a 32,000 person strong sales force. And they have hundreds of new products, and often, and he described one particular one, products would get released and people would have no clue what the product even did and had no idea how to sell it. Except he somehow found out that one person in the Netherlands nailed the positioning and could absolutely land, the whole product with clients. And he was able to find this out and get that knowledge from that person. But with a learning culture, that would have disseminated a lot more naturally. And that is coming from the workforce, not from top-down, traditional training. So to dig a bit deep here, one of the things I posted on LinkedIn today about learning in the flow of work, and people confuse that, and we talked a little bit about integrating working and learning. People think learning in the flow of work means the same thing, but often that stops short of just putting stuff into Teams or Slack, and that's learning in the flow of work. And so you shared an article you wrote actually around the difference between managing learning in the flow of work and enabling it. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, in the corporate learning world, people right now seem very obsessed with the idea of putting learning everywhere that people do their jobs. And I think they forget that people are there to do their jobs, right? Salespeople spend something like 40% of their day in Salesforce. but most of that time is doing things like updating accounts and productivity. They're there to get a job done. People aren't there to take courses. I don't think people go to Slack or Teams to take courses. I do think people have lots of conversations in Slack and Teams. I think they can get feedback in those things. But I think it speaks directly to what Rebecca was talking about, which is this idea of sort of the diversity of learning experiences. Everybody that works in learning, whether from K-12 all the way up through corporate learning, understands, because they've been taught this, that learning isn't just classes and courses. And yet, if you think about how companies allocate their budgets, their time, their mind space to creating learning experiences, delivering learning to their workforce, a lot of it still revolves around classes and courses and content, and pushing content at people. And I think one of the big hallmarks of a vibrant, positive learning culture, and we see this in our research, you can also see this very clearly in all the other academic and business research that's been published on this, is it's not just about consuming, it's also about contributing, which is exactly what Rebecca was talking about.
Yeah, turning consumption into creation. I love that. This also reminds me, PJ, we've talked a lot about looking at the whole human, and you focus a lot on the person at the center of this, the learner, right? How does that come into learning culture for you?
Yeah, actually, in the previous panel, they're talking about how soft skills were human skills, and I always think about those are power skills, right? I think even more so, we forget that talent is a human being who's bringing that to the workplace, and that human has identities, they have perceptions, they have stories, they have feelings, all that. And sometimes we forget to make sure that humans coming into those learning experiences, or we understand their previous identity in terms of their last job. And a lot of times we're teaching managers or employees or peers in team settings, like taking a moment to say, who are you? Who am I? Because each and every time, our cultures are changing every single day. I mean, I just heard that it's not the Great Resignation, it's a Great Reshuffling. So if teams are constantly in this forming and norming and performing mode, you have to reset trust every single day. And so when I think about learning culture, a lot of our time and focus is actually enabling the manager to actually create, though, similar to the managing in the flow of work, we've been pivoting to more of department team-based learning, because that inclusive language or common language actually starts at the core of the team. And so rather than doing a lot of cross-functional learning, which is also really important, we do that at the leadership level, we're trying to integrate feedback skills at the team level, because feedback looks a little different in engineering or, say, in product or sales. And now that teams are actually coming back or reconnecting, we want to encourage and empower the manager to, hey, when you bring your team together, insert a 90-minute session on how this team looks to connect over feedback, or how they think about communicating and building team norms. So my team is pivoting to do more in-team-based training to actually build more common language. And I have this perception that we'll be redefining what inclusion can look like on a team setting. Because when another leader sees, oh, I integrated a team learning, and it's like, who did that? I was like, well, the people development team helped us do that. That will be something that will be contagious, and hopefully that in the flow will be actually championed by the leader. And that's a cue that an employee needs to see that I belong here, my manager cares about us as a team, or me. So we're just starting that journey as we pivot from more of a cross-functional base to more of a team-based learning approach, because I think the reconnection and connection, that's constant cycle for teams, is important that be a learning flywheel as well.
Yeah, you touched on a point, the role of managers, and also I think thinking it's not just the manager, but lots of different roles play important roles within this. Jen, you have a massive frontline associate workforce, lots of different roles, also very different skills as well, a lot of harder skills. How do you think about the roles and how they fit into learning culture?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things that's really unique at Sam's Club is that 75% of our management population started in our hourly roles. And that's something that we can really lean into, right? That put them in a very unique position where they can empathize with the hourly associates and what they're going through because they walked in their shoes. But one of the things that we were seeing in our data over the past year and a half was we were seeing from our assessment data that managers were putting varying levels of importance on developing associates. And then on the other side of that coin, what we were seeing was we were hearing from our associates that they wanted more development. And we were seeing that more than ever. So we have, I think, in the industry right now, we're calling it manager capabilities. We're calling it manager quality. I don't know why. We had to do our own thing. But we created what we call a manager quality program as one of the levers to solve for this. And it's based around a framework of how to identify, develop, and manage and reward talent, which is just, that's a very simple, basic framework. But what we wanted to do was ensure that we got our entire population in the field through that experience. And the 100,000 associates, that's a lot of people to get through an experience. But what we also wanted to make sure of as well was that it was individualized, personalized, set within this framework. So we created it very much like, I would call like Lego blocks that click together, whereas if you're in the different levels of the club, you go through the program, but it all clicks together, it's very seamless, and then when you promote, you go through again, but the content's not duplicative, it's rather building on the experience that you had before. One of the other things that we were very thoughtful about in this experience is, traditionally, what we have done in the past is we have a program for hourlies. All hourlies are going to go through this program. Well, then what happens is the hourlies come back and they're really excited about everything that they learned, but if your management didn't get the same information and you're trying to implement it, that could potentially be more difficult. So we really tried to take a tops-down meets bottoms-up approach to this, trying to bring everybody in kind of these heterogeneous cohorts through the program. But what that did is really created this community of learning that we're talking about. And, I know it makes people kind of go when you say like community over content, but that's really what's happening. The content itself is simple: identify, develop, manage, and reward. I mean, these are your basic essential skills. This is, how do I conduct a good interview? How do I develop an associate? But if you can get everybody talking about that and reflecting about it, that's when you really start to see the change.
Yeah, and it's grounded in practice then, right? And in the actual challenges people are facing. So one of the last components of, we're painting this picture of what an ideal learning culture looks like, is going back to the Instructor Academy, right? Like empowering and enabling the proven domain experts within the business to share that knowledge with others. Right. How did you approach that?
Yeah, so back in 2015, we started Code Academy. And the Code Academy was basically just organic, grassroots, engineers wanting to teach non-technical people about what they do, whether it be coding or whatever the case may be, some technical topic. As I was looking at, and again, we educated over 8,500 people this way across the world, right? This is an amazing program that was just completely grassroots. And then what I was noticing, though, is as I was observing those instructors with my background in education, I was saying, oh, they really don't know how to create curriculum. And so I'm creating actually a certification program for instructors in the company, and it was an amazing success. What we found was that the people who learned the pedagogy and learned the learning theory, they didn't just teach classes. They changed the way that they were conducting meetings. They were because they were understanding how people were learning and consuming information, not just training, but just information in general. And it completely changed their outlook on how they did their meetings, how they did their one-on-ones, and so forth. So when you think about manager development of their people, they actually began to learn what it takes to develop people in the thinking. And the foundation of that was simply Bloom's taxonomy, right? Something as simple as Bloom's taxonomy can change an entire culture into a more learning culture if people just know it. It's a great framework, and it's super simple, and it's been around forever, right? So why not go back to those older tools that we know about, teach people how to do that, and then they can begin to structure their conversations, structure their trainings, whatever it is that they're giving, in a way that people can really consume that information and use it, apply it, and synthesize it to make better decisions later. So all
of these are great examples of some of the key components of, you mentioned the word flywheel, of this And I think of it as that it's organic. It becomes organic, right? And it's a lot of work to get it going, but eventually it does take on its own life, and it's an incredible thing to behold. But there are challenges in implementing this, right? So I'd love to, maybe Todd, we can start with you, because you've looked at a lot of research and done a cross section. What are the roadblocks in putting this in place?
Everybody always points at time, and I hate that, because if you really believe what we all say, most learning happens in the real world, either through experience, through reflection, or through interactions with other people, not in a class or a course, right? So it's all around us all the time if we know how to access it. So I think what I hear from our customers, like more than anything, they talk about it in terms of time, but actually it's getting people to reset the way that they define learning and development. And that's from the top down, and it's also from the bottom up, right? People don't value things they don't see. And so, I hear from customers all the time, well, we want to do these things, but then everybody says, where's our training program? Where's the class? That's the biggest obstacle that I see over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, I love that. Like, there's a legibility to that. We've created a training, and we can roll it out. Like, we seem to have solved something, but it's the stuff you can't see. And I think what you were, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's time to think, time to reflect, is like, that's the stuff you don't see, but
it's that stuff. It's what Jen was talking about a minute ago, right? Feedback. Feedback can come from your manager. Feedback can come from your customers. Feedback can come from your boss. Feedback can come from some random person.
Yeah.
But if people don't recognize that as an opportunity to learn, they don't value it.
Yeah.
Right? We didn't repeat this question in this survey, but a couple of years ago we asked the question, how much do you think your company spends on your learning and development? And the average, if you believe the ATD numbers, is somewhere around $1,300 a year for US employees. What we saw was really interesting, though. People guessed on average around $1,100, but there was a very clear correlation between how much people thought their companies spend on them and their net promoter score around learning culture. The more they felt the learning, the more they valued the learning and the growth experience that they had at their company and gave the company credit for it. And the biggest difference between the positive and the negatives was how diverse their learning experiences were. The more diverse the experiences that people had for learning were, the more they recognized all of the little bits and pieces in between the big transformational experiences.
And the crazy thing is this doesn't actually take an outsized investment in training. What are some of the roadblocks you've faced and tackled?
Yeah, so there was something that you said that I also wanted to kind of echo and tap on, is just a program doesn't fix everything, right? Just because creating a training program actually doesn't fix that. It's that exposure education experience model that you were talking about. So roadblocks. So I think, one of the, and this is a very simple thing, but it's like really just putting yourselves in the learner's shoes. So one of the things that we realized was that we were offering like a lot of stuff. Some of it was really awesome. But if nobody knows where to find the really awesome stuff, no one knows that it exists. And I think this is probably an issue, like I'm sure that you've talked to a lot of large companies. We really had to kind of create a single entry point into learning. That's our Samsfield U concept, and that's our single entry point into all learning experiences. I mean, it seems like the simplest thing, like, yes, you should have one way in, right? Not 10,000 ways in. But I think sometimes it's the low-hanging fruit, right? It's the cleanup, it's the contextualization and the curation, and really making sure that we're providing, you don't need to provide 10,000 experiences. You need to just provide a really suite of great experiences.
Less is more. Thank you. Yeah. Continuing that, you talk about the access point. I love that. To extend that, PJ, I want to bring you in on the idea of making learning seem worthwhile. You guys do a lot of work around career pathing. Can you talk about how that plays into all of this?
Yeah, there's actually a big initiative at PagerDuty called the Career Development Experience my team is leading, and obviously it starts with the career architecture, right? We're actually updating it because it's been 4 years old. But we actually have to rethink actually what the career development looks like today is that if people are moving and reshuffling outside of the workplace, then that means they're probably going to be curious on reshuffling within the workplace. And that means that we have to almost teach managers to think, how is your team changing every 8 to 12 months in terms of what they work on, the scope, how can someone actually have a stretch assignment? So we're looking at more from a moves and moments standpoint, is that yes, there's the architecture that is a basis for comp bands and leveling, but then when I double down into, say, engineering and look at SD1 or go into product or maybe sales, what am I getting net new, whether it be working on a territory if I'm in sales, but with a certain kind of industry? Or am I going to be working on a different set of different features in a product? Or can I actually do a pro bono project with our social impact team? So we're actually looking at building pathways, which is what a lot of people are talking about now, but teaching managers how to manage and build career and have conversations around this idea of moments and moves, whether it means like losing your team member for 6 months to do a pro bono project, or letting go of talent because this person's done a great job here and that skill set can be used at another manager's team. So letting go is kind of hard given the fact that you're trying to retain your team, but that moment can actually be a learning experience that is not controlled by my team. It is controlled because there's an opportunity within the organization to actually leverage your skill set here and maybe move it over into another department or team in 6 months. So that's a mindset shift. And so one thing we're thinking about one thing we're actually doing, we're going to launch in Q3, is managing in the gray. And so because humans are, it's like the human is now tired. And managers are faced with new conversations that they never had to have before. I think a lot of our mental models don't have that human, inclusive, diversity, or equity lens that we need to bring into the conversation. And so I'm excited to actually have managers not know the real answer. Look at the human and figure out how you tailor your career conversation. Look at the human and figure out how you need to tailor your feedback. Look at the human in that interview process to figure out how you can actually give someone a chance if they don't have the perfect, tick all the boxes in their interview process, but you're creating opportunity because there's potential there. And so that's kind of the net new things that we're exploring at PagerDuty, because we almost have to kind of try and experiment because the market is changing every 3 to 6 months at this rate. And if we can kind of keep things net new and fresh, I think someone will decide to stay versus find their next career move somewhere else.
You mentioned a few things. I heard you sort of agreeing, so I'm going to bring you in here because I know you also think very broadly about learning, and I'm going to get specific on what I'll tee you up with here. But the idea that at the end that you mentioned, so it's the role of cohorts, right? And the role managers and leaders play in helping with career pathing and all these kind of things in that cohort setting, and then that's that flywheel that's kicking in there. How do you think of that? How do you inspire some people who kind of see, maybe they don't have that growth mindset, that they think they've learned it all, to show them that they actually have a role to play within this sort of system of learning?
Yeah, so when you put the power of, I'll call it teaching, and I hate to use that term in this case, but if you put the role of the facilitator into the hands of the SMEs, it changes everything, right? So rather than being top down from someone who may not be as technical or so forth, you can inspire people, because here's what happens. When you get into a situation and you're facilitating, you may think that you know everything about that particular topic, but there is inevitably going to be a question that arises that you don't necessarily know an exact answer to. And that's the epiphany that happens to say, oh, I have more to learn. And that is something unique that happens when you facilitate or teach. Because you think going in, as a K-12 educator for 12 years, I always learned more from my students than I learned from my formal training. So if we take that concept and we say, okay, let's introduce these SMEs to teaching or facilitating a session, there will be questions that will stump them. There will be questions that make them rethink. And that is a trigger, and they get excited about that because they recognize, wow, I do have more in this space to learn. And I would even suggest that bringing in a form of academic debate into the work setting can be one of the most valuable things, because if you force a person to go against a topic that they actually strongly believe in, they learn what they don't know. And so giving them those opportunities to really dig in is exciting. And it will turn a person who truly believes that they know everything on a topic into a student again. That's a beautiful thing.
Perpetuating the flywheel, yeah. Another challenge that comes into this, I know you've each seen this at your companies. Todd, you probably had a lot of, at the customers that you guys have, is firefighting mode, right? There's no time to think and to reflect and to put into action the things that you're learning. How are you all combating this? How are you making training seem worthwhile and creating the space and the place for it to happen? PJ, do you want to kick it off?
Well, I think it's important to, I find that recently, because we were doing our engagement survey in a couple months, is people want transparency, and even naming, we are in firefighting mode. Actually say we are in firefighting mode. And even if you can say as a manager or as the people development team, we're saying we're in firefighting mode, but here's how you manage the noise, right? And giving actual real examples for how peers or teams are actually navigating that noise. Because I think when you try to show up and appear that there's no fires, then people are not getting the real story. So instead, I want to give permission to not break rules, but actually say actually this is where you're going to fight fires. So what works is, if you're scheduling a meeting, is actually making sure when someone shows up to your meeting that there's a purpose, some expectations, there's an agenda, and there's roles, because that person is going to show up in the midst of the fire, right? So when we teach how to do effective communications or effective meetings, we're thinking about, you're going to do a meeting when people are rushing from back-to-back Zoom meetings, right? We're going to we really try to bring that sense of, this is the fire, the dumpster could be right here, but it's okay, because you're surrounded by team members who can have healthy debate, like you're mentioning, right? And I think it's really important that, I think managers, I really care about the managers so much, because they have the opportunity to give permission or not be the smartest person in the room. Because then they can learn, you can learn a hack from your own team who could be a rotator who just graduated from college. And you're like, you're doing that? I should try that. But I think of the structure your team environments that way, and you have to almost teach managers how to rethink their environment. So I kind of say the firefighting mode is, I think we should say, if people are firefighting at work, they're more than likely firefighting at home. So if they haven't figured out how to firefight at home, then they're not going to really quite figure out how to firefight at work. And so it's almost like rethinking your one-on-one to say, what's one thing you need to get through today? And if you can kind of apply that hack on both personal and professional, I do think you're slowly chipping away at the noise, but making it okay to bring up what's not working and actually experiment with something you haven't tried before. I'm not sure if I have a real answer, but I'm trying to say, give permission for people to recognize there's a fire versus ignoring it, and then maybe work together to put out the fire as a team.
Yeah, empower people, put the responsibility and empower them to help figure it out together. Jen, I'm going to ask you for your perspective. Just to throw it out to the audience, we probably will have time for one question. So if anybody has one percolating, I'm going to come to you in a second. But how do you guys approach it at Sam's Club?
Yeah, so one of the things that we realized was, as we're going through this, issuing the handhelds to all associates, was we're kind of going through an evolution where we're able to prioritize tasks and work in the club. So traditionally, if you think about it, an associate may be in the back room and there's 10 pallets that need to be unloaded. So human nature would be you would unload the first pallet. But perhaps the hole on the floor is where the milk is that all the members are coming in to get. But if we're able to use technology to prioritize those tasks, then the associate would know, wait, I don't unload this pallet, I unload the 1-2 back. But then what that does is then that frees up time. And when we free up that time, that gives that associate more time and space to learn. So it's combining that with also pushing the learning and the flow of work, which has created more of that experience. Part of our culture and part of our strategy is invest in our associates as well. That's part of our business flywheel. So all of our learning is tied to business outcomes, right? Because ultimately what drives business outcomes is associate behavior. And if we're able to train and learn and change that associate behavior, that makes that flywheel continue to spin, and we're able to invest in our associates all over again.
I love it. Flywheels upon flywheels. Does anybody have a question for the panel?
Just a reminder why people are thinking about that. These behaviors that she's talking about, that's the culture.
Yeah, yeah, great point. Okay, so we don't have one. Okay, well, no, I've only got 3.
Scarcity.
You were the loudest, so let's
So, in a panel I was in earlier this afternoon, it was about the teacher shortage, and somebody had a very astute observation that we don't give teachers a space to fail. You're talking a lot about putting managers in a learning, in a teaching role. And if I were a manager, I would be terrified that if I failed as the teacher, that would cost me in my organization. So how do you deal with the problem of if you put that responsibility on managers, that they are likely to be, or they, depending upon the culture you've got, there's the possibility that they may be worried about failing and that may hinder their ability to do it.
Such a good question.
So I would like to rename what's so bad about failure, right? So when you fail, you learn, right? So if a manager is not trying to appear perfect all the time, their team can actually learn from them. How do I deal with someone who is not a collaborative thinker? How do I deal with someone who has negotiated their offer 3 times in the candidate process? Rather than failure, think of it as a teaching manager is hey, name the feelings you're feeling. You can't, because I think when someone's encouraged or is inspired to actually be a people manager, they won't be worried about failing. It's my manager asked me these questions. My manager had these feelings, and I feel the same way my manager did. So I can't speak for K through 12 teachers, but I think a lot of books we read about management is you must appear, that you have it all together. But I think a lot of managers are screaming inside with what are the answers, right? So I kind of say in the learning spaces that we create, it's try to tell them that there's no one answer, especially with the wave of diversity, inclusion, equity. Why would we think there's one answer? So you kind of actually want to fail fast in a safe environment where there's people around you say hey, I know you did it this way, but if you actually change your tone or you thought be more aware of your behaviors, you create more energy that's more inclusive versus exclusive. I'm okay with a manager failing a little bit, right? Now, of course, that needs to be top down, right, and bottoms up, but I would really hope that people aren't seeing failure as I'm gonna be fired tomorrow, rather than I learned so much, let's do a retro to figure out how we avoid that next time.
It's almost in the definition of learning, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it also has to do with there's not one kind of failure, right? I've heard this principle described in sort of various ways, right? A one-way door versus a two-way door, or are you dropping a glass ball or are you dropping a rubber ball? Some things you can't come back from. You want to be really extra special careful around those. Some things are not a big deal. And I think helping people understand that, maybe giving them some principles and guidelines to understand which is which, to give them some latitude to do that. And then the other thing is just being very intentional about building in the feedback and reflection mechanisms to get something out of it for the organization. Everybody talks about that, but I very, very rarely see that in practice.
Yeah. So I want to quickly wrap things up here. We're actually running a workshop. I'm running a workshop upstairs right after this. So if anybody wants to kind of dig deeper into it, please come and join us. Same applies to all of you. I invited every single one of these folks up here to join me at this conference. Some came down just for this event because they are some of the best and most forward-thinking people around this topic of learning culture that I've come across. Fortunately, there are more like them out there. And so, you know, the part of what I want to try and do is bring this community to light and say, look, there's a better way to learn. And so please join me in thanking everyone up here for coming and joining us.